Carl Norberg. You're an opinion former with your blog Palantir. You could briefly be described as an economic columnist. Is there anything in this presentation that you would like to add?
I would say that I try to give a picture of reality in economic contexts that are normally missing in the media.
Approximately how many readers do you reach?
It varies, but it is a number of thousands per day.
What seems to be your approach is that we are in the economically governed society together, and so nobody benefits from living in ignorance. Many readers will therefore turn to you to find out how things really are. Some people have also asked for a debate between you and the finance minister. How do you see your role?
Well, I think it describes the situation quite well. Just that there is still some kind of demand for that kind of debate. And then you could say that it expresses in turn that there is a kind of democratic deficit in society. People somehow feel that politics does not convey the information they need, or the true picture of reality that they have experienced every day in their everyday life. It is true that the information climate has changed with the internet. Previously, the information climate was such that information moved vertically and was guided, so to speak, all the time by the controlled media. Now the internet, so to speak, has changed the direction of the information flow. It instead lies on the horizontal plane. And it also means that when people discover that their former vertical information does not match their own perceived view of reality, then there will be a questioning.
If a monopoly exists on information, does the information provider control civil society?
The one who controls the flow of information also controls, in some way, opinion formation and can steer public opinion in the desired direction. But in the current situation, you could say that it is incredibly difficult to control public opinion so widely as required today with the internet. Then you could say that the internet increases transparency. The driving force in these issues is always an individual profit maximization objective. That's the foundation, the basis for the sequence of events that determines the direction of society. For a very long time, or only on few occasions, one might say, rather, there has been some kind of altruistic purpose, but then that's how it is, of course, all the time, that as long as there is no transparency, the individual profit maximization will come into play as a driving force. And once it enters the situation and takes hold, it always grows outwards.
Could a revolution be started without financial resources?
A prerequisite for a revolution or revolt or upheaval of any kind to take place? Well, what is the general consciousness like? And you can say that earlier, when the information has been economically controlled through the media, then it has not been possible in any way to engage in revolutions. Because the flow of information has always been regulated by the controlling power. So it can be said that with a fair degree of certainty one can conclude, at least with great credibility one can state, that the revolutions and uprisings that have taken place, mainly after the French Revolution of 1789, you could say that at least there is some degree that the powers at be had its fingers in the cookie jar. But as answer to that question, it can be said that in the past, in modern times, it has not been entirely reasonable and credible that one has been able to create social transformations without financial resources. But in the current situation, it is at least a minor requirement of financial resources to bring about major changes. Then we will see how far this goes, of course. But we should not underestimate the fact that in the current situation, internet infrastructure is not in any small part controlled by the same actors. But so far, it's not threatening enough to them for them to choose to shut it down, which may well happen.
A movie that you highlighted in your blog is The Goodness by Swedish film director Stefan Jarl. He has been recognized for making the film trilogy about Kenta and Stoffe. They call us mods, and won the Swedish Guldbagge for it. A Decent Life in 1979. But he is now making a new production about the economy in society, which has been stopped by Swedish television. Is the movie so close to the truth about what it really looks like that Swedish television doesn't want to let it out?
Yes, that's a good point. That movie describes, so to speak, the consequences of the inherent character and nature of the system. It does not, of course, address the fundamental problem that there is a single controlled credit-based system for the purpose of trade in goods and services in society, or what is really called the division of labor. It does not. But it describes very well the consequences of what this will look like, inevitably, what it will evolve into. This system with its inherent nature and character, it must go where society has gone. It can't be any other way, it's unconditional, and therefore we can with good reason say that Stefan Jarl and Mr. Berggren, they describe it very well, I would say. And from that perspective, you could say that it probably doesn't work to the benefit of the system in terms of opinion formation. But what we can say is that this movie would definitely make people aware of the fact that there is something that is wrong to a greater extent than what is already obvious today. And then we come to the point of the story. What is so dangerous about this movie? Well, just that aspect that people are aware of it, because then people will start wondering, why is it like this really? And then the risk is suddenly obvious that people will start addressing the problem for real, the fundamental problem itself. And that is how money is created and how it gets its value. And what is money? Instead of what is now normal, that people only see what money does. That is, what can money buy? How does money work in relation to each other? That's how people look at it. But people don't think about, what is money anyway? When is it born? When does it come into circulation? What do they consist of? And so on. Because that is the determining function for the developments in the world today. And that's the problem with this movie, that it takes people further, one step closer to the question that will decide this whole thing.
A question that appears on posters in the movie Goodness. In the background, the Occupy movement is visible, and on a billboard it says, "They have lent 755 billion Swedish krona to the people, out of 10 billion equity. How will we pay back money that never existed? Ask your bank." How do you view that question?
I have given a speech at Sergel's Torg for the Occupy movement, and I guess you could say this, because of money being what it is and is created by the bank, when taking a debt document that has been signed by someone and records it as a monetary deposit, which is then matched by the resulting loan, it is the case that the debts are always going to exceed what is possible to pay. And one more aspect to this is that the interest on the debt is not within the scope of the nominal amount. So if the debt is $100, the interest cost of the debt is not within the framework of that $100. This means that new debts have to be created all the time to cover the interest payment on the previous one. This results in the formation of something that can be called accumulated interest cost growth or aggregated interest cost, depending on the context. And this means that the system as such requires perpetual growth, and then you can become a little crass, as even a small child can observe that on a finite planet. It seems difficult to have perpetual organic growth, meaning things we produce and so on. And in a system that requires perpetual growth, somewhere these two things have to divide. Then this money can no longer describe organic values to any credible extent. And then you can say that when that point occurs, then we have a credibility crisis within the system. And that's why they also say that the system is based on trust. And since the bank's money, meaning these credits, is what is recorded as an asset in the bank's balance sheets, the value of the bank's credits in the balance sheets is also what constitutes the value of our money. And what the central bank therefore has as a monetary policy objective is something called price stability. So the translation from a democratic perspective of price stability is the maintenance of the value of the credits in the balance sheets of private banks. And then you might spontaneously think, that doesn't sound very democratic. You could say that it sounds almost even anti-democratic. If you put a different slant on this, it is the private bank's money that controls the economy, the same economy that controls politics. And the central bank's task is price stability, that is, to guard the value of the bank's credits in their balance sheets. Then it is almost as if one can suspect that actually the central banks are not controlled by the government. And naturally, that's the way it is. The central banks are regulated by operational rules, or so to speak. It's subject to the rules controlled by the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. And it's the BIS that makes all the decisions on how things are supposed to function.
Could you explain a concept called fractional reserve banking?
Fractional reserve banking, that's what you could say. What you described earlier in the discussion here as a diversion. So it's not the case that the banks are lending out something that they have. The banks are lending something that they do not have. Banks lend credit. Credit constitutes 97% of the circulating money supply in most modern economies. And this means that this fractional reserve lending, it's really more or less smoke and mirrors. And a fundamental problem with this type of discussion, and it is a strong point that you make, and especially when it comes to economics, because that's when people are happily getting bamboozled, asking what are capital requirements ratios? What are reserve requirements? What is Tier 1 and Tier 2? Well, because 97% of all money is made up of these credits, it is still the case that even what is recorded as common equity Tier 1 and Tier 2 are also only credits. And then you can put it as a close acquaintance of mine who sits as a high manager at a bank. He says that he has tried to argue that it may not be the most appropriate idea to hold Greek government bonds as CET1 capital because there is an obvious risk of something going wrong here. And then the very essence of the bank is gone. But it is, so to speak, this is not a problem that the politicians want to address because they can't do anything about it. Unless they expropriate the whole banking system. And no politician we have elected today is that brave. No matter how bad it is for the country when the system fails, they're not that brave, and they'd rather hold on to the situation and the system as it is, because they are there for their individual benefit and not for the common good. And we see examples of that across the board. It doesn't really matter how bad the development is or how far the social disintegration goes. Politicians in general, and especially those at the top, will not address this problem come hell or high water. They prefer to hold on to their situation and hope to stay around the pot for one more day. And the method for creating money is rather simple. And that's why it's important to keep the smoke and the mirrors intact, so that people do not discover how this is done. This process is done with a purpose, and the purpose is financial incentives of the private banks, where the money is being created, which the Swedish Riksbank has confirmed in innumerable documents that the private banks can influence the money supply. Then this fundamental fact is given that private banks do manipulate the money supply, all according to the Riksbank. And how does this work? Well, it works as follows. The banks take a note of the debt physically. Call that debt instrument or promissory note a deposit. This deposit is recorded in the bank at the nominal amount expressed on the debt note. At the same moment, the corresponding amount is deposited in a disposal account of the debtor. Thus, the debtor pays interest to the bank to borrow his own debt as money. And so these credits are the money that makes up 97% of the money supply and circulates as means of payment in the modern economy. This is not very complicated. It's not nuclear science. Then they try to hide it behind different capital adequacy requirements and quotas and other things that make people confused. So the reconciliation in relation to the concepts will take place afterwards. What is interesting and central and also fundamental with this issue is in which point money is created and with what motive. It is in the bank's profit maximization motive, and it is in the bank where money is created. The consequence of this is that demands for ever-increasing growth becomes the inherent nature of money within an organically limited space. And anybody, even small children, can understand that this is not sustainable in the long term. And this then leads to a lot of really bad consequences over time. When no longer the organic growth, that is, things that we make, produce with real values, when it can no longer meet the aggregate interest cost growth, then something called debt saturation occurs. That is, when every new amount of money is required for the most part to pay for previously created money, to cover its costs which have been aggregated. And this in turn means that the money starts to move from the organic productive economy into the financial sector to an increased extent. That is, money goes back faster to the birthplace of old money at an increasingly rapid pace and moving less inside the productive economy, which in turn causes the money supply in the organic economy to shrink. At the same time as the financial economy is expanding, the real economy is shrinking. That is, a shrinking, stagnant economy here, and while there is expanding amount of money in the financial part. In other words, we have price inflation in the financial segment. That is the historically high stock market prices, historically high house prices, prices for financial assets. There is price inflation there. When it comes to organic productivity, it shrinks, it stagnates. Then we have inflation here and stagnation there. Then we have stagflation as a common concept.